This year, I decided to start broadening my horizons and play a wider variety of games instead of mostly returning to my handful of comfort games, which mostly included the Witcher trilogy and a couple of action RPGs like Diablo or Last Epoch. On this journey, there is a specific trend that keeps showing up, and I'm sure that some people at the very least will relate to it. The more expectations I have for a title, the more extreme my thoughts on it tend to be. Either it ends up being exactly what I wanted and it's thoroughly enjoyable, or it goes against what I expected and I'm left with a bitter taste in my mouth. It's rarely in the middle. There are games that I jump into with basically no expectations, but Dragon Age Inquisition was not one of those. Expectation can be created through various means, of course, be it the previous games in a series, the game trailers, or even dev interviews, things like that. But ultimately, whether expectations are met or not comes down to how everything feels together and how it compares to the image that you had in your mind beforehand. So, welcome to Paradoxa Gaming, and let's talk about what that image was like for me before playing Dragon Age Inquisition. Well, since I played the games back to back, previous titles are pretty much the only thing I based my expectations on. I started with Dragon Age Origins, which is now definitely in the top 3 of my favorite RPGs I have ever played. I loved the storytelling so much, and the characters were so iconic and well written. The combat was deep and engaging, it felt rewarding, satisfying, and it had me using my brain often to get out of tricky situations. On the other end, Dragon Age 2, while limited in many ways, still felt like home, albeit a very small and repetitive one. It managed once again to craft a compelling story with characters and companions that definitely had me hooked. Ignoring Dragon Age 2's weaknesses would be foolish though, because it was far from reaching the potential I thought a sequel actually had. It was mostly due to the limited resources and development time, which made it difficult to achieve anything nearly as rich as Origins. So it was definitely more of a light version, but again, it felt like home. So what did that lead me to expect from Inquisition? Pretty much a more modern version of Origins, built on the foundations of this series and mostly keeping its formula to craft a novel yet familiar experience. Of course, I wasn't expecting it to be better than Origin in every single way, or not to take any risks with some changes. For example, the combat was definitely simplified significantly in Dragon Age 2, so I thought that trend might continue, but I expected to still feel the Dragon Age DNA in the game. Basically a story-first approach with strategic, engaging combat encounters in a world that feels familiar. For instance, I think that The Witcher does that quite effectively, while each game in the trilogy definitely feels different and certainly tries to improve the recipe. It's not exactly reinventing it, you know? The transition flows pretty smoothly between all of them. Unfortunately, as hinted at earlier, I can't say the same about Dragon Age and Inquisition. So, let's get into the key aspects of the game that lead to issues for me based on the 16-17 hours that I've spent with the game so far. Let's begin with one of the big changes. The semi-open world design, which is way more open than Origins, is designed in a way that I simply wasn't prepared for. It's filled with content everywhere, but it's mostly filler. I don't even know if there is good to be found in the side quests, for example, because after doing 4 or 5 fetch quests, which offered very little in terms of storytelling, I'm just not even engaging with them anymore. There are also the Fade portals to close and many things to collect/discover around the map. While I'm sure it'll be appealing for some, it simply isn't what I play Dragon Age for. With that being said, the new additions seem to be pushing the storytelling a bit further down on the priority list, which isn't what I had hoped to see. Another good example of that is the mount. It's handy and useful, it's almost necessary actually to navigate the map. Thing is, the companions literally disappear when you hop on, which means I'd miss a bunch of ambient dialogue, which at times can be very important for the companions' development or the story setup. I remember back in Origins, I'd often stop whatever I was doing just to listen to what the companions were saying to each other, so it definitely matters. You know, I don't want to have to choose between convenience or character development, so on paper, the open world is a good idea, but I think their approach leads to an unavoidable clash of identities almost, to a certain extent. Now, obviously, while navigating the world, there are plenty of creatures and enemies to slay, so how good's the combat? This might come down to personal taste, but the ways in which the companions interact, in particular, with each other, at least early on, feels very limited instead of interactive to me. It also feels like I'm mostly just spamming my abilities as soon as they're available without much thought going into it. Not because I don't want to, but because my options are limited, be it because the encounters feel similar or because the options available to me are more limited than in Origins. Dragon Age 2 was already simpler as well, as mentioned, but frankly I think that the abilities felt more impactful and snappy than they do in Inquisition, which made it feel more like an action-oriented game, but in Inquisition I'm mostly just bored, to be honest. So with the combat and the open world design, as well as the bigger emphasis on gathering activities like herb collecting or mining, it's easy to see why many are comparing this game to a solo MMORPG. There's a lot of repetitive, grindy content. It's not overwhelming, but it's not what I really want to spend my time doing in a Dragon Age game. There's surely an audience for that kind of experience, right? But was a Dragon Age game the right kind of game to include that in? I'm not so sure. It's probably fair to add that based on the little research I did, it looks like the Hinterlands region is definitely one of the worst in terms of being bloated with content, and while yes, I would agree that some of the other regions I've explored so far have felt slightly better, I still wouldn't say that they were packed with interesting stuff to interact with. With that being said, I'm still interested to see how it is in the rest of the game. Alright, switching topics, I want to talk about how I hated how the game felt on mouse and keyboard, so I switched to controller, which is something that I had to do against my will, because I much preferred to use mouse and keyboard when it felt good in the two previous titles. On a separate note, I want to talk about the UI. UI can easily be underrated in games, I feel, but it's a key aspect of how a game looks and feels, and I personally have mixed feelings about this one. I think it doesn't really look similar to the previous titles, but I also am not a big fan of the font they used. It feels bland and it just lacks personality, really. I wish they created something that made it feel more like the medieval, dark fantasy experience it's supposed to be instead of this more generic, modern-looking approach. Similarly, the music isn't bad, but it certainly isn't familiar. They changed the composer, so it makes sense, but I think that while the overall soundtrack seems to fit the game nicely and does the job, once again, it contributes to a rougher transition between the games just because it's different. While a few changes could be refreshing, the many shifts feel a bit jarring, making it harder for me to find what ties the experience together and truly makes this feel like a Dragon Age game. So overall, it's fair to say that for me, Inquisition is just not passing the initial vibe check. It's not all bad though, because I'm still finding some things interesting. For example, I like all of the lore bits that we can find around the world. The companions from a narrative perspective have been pretty good. I also like the look of the game as well. I think it's beautiful and it makes me want to explore the world. And the story, when it's actually progressing, is actually quite intriguing. Being in control of the Inquisition is another example of something new that I still enjoy. I think it's pretty unique, and it certainly adds interesting things to the experience, although we're quite far from the building an army for a blight kind of days. If this game was the first in a series, I probably would have approached it with an open mind, and I can see how my feelings towards it could have ended up being very, very different. You know, it's definitely a polished game that's offering a bunch of things to engage with. The offering is quite different though, since it's clearly trying to reinvent itself, which is a double-edged sword that went a bit too far on the novelty side in my opinion, while also somewhat forgetting the core experience of the originals. But is it even bad that Inquisition took such a different approach? I personally am a big fan of respecting your series' identity and making sure that your current fans are satisfied. If you want to attract more people, you can try to expand in smart ways, but it's definitely really tricky. But the reality with Inquisition is that it simply isn't the modern origins that I wanted, and that's okay. I just feel like they didn't necessarily have to go back to the drawing board because, damn, I thought Origins was so good. What did they think was so wrong about it that resulted in them making all these changes? I can absolutely see why Inquisition seems to be pretty divisive in the Dragon Age fandom because it's clear. It will be enjoyable for a lot of people because it's not a bad game. It's a Dragon Age game, a new take for sure, but it still is. Can't blame people for enjoying it, but also can't blame people for being disappointed in it. But it sure is different. And I guess it played out fine, right? It won Game of the Year, and it's obvious that overall it has favorable reviews, so Dragon Age Inquisition doesn't have to be for me, and I'm okay with that. But now I have seen what the game is mostly about. And while approaching it with my current expectations would not be a winning strategy, I think that if I wait until I crave more of what I have actually seen from Inquisition specifically, instead of being in this state of being disappointed that I don't have Origins 2.0, I'll probably have a better time. It's all a matter of expectations for me yet again. Once I feel like going back, I'll approach it with more of an open mind. I'll try to take my time with the open world and give it a shot for real. If it doesn't feel any better, I'll probably end up skipping a lot of stuff and mostly begin just focusing on the story objectives because I'm still enjoying that part of the game for sure. That sums up my thoughts and the things I wanted to cover for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. I know this is a fairly controversial topic, so let's try to remain constructive in the comments, but I'm interested. How do you feel about how Dragon Age evolved as a series? Also, my full review for Inquisition will probably be coming in a couple of months, so make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss that. But that's it for today. Consider liking the video if you enjoyed, and I'll be back soon with more videos. Bye bye.